So Garth didn't send me an introduction, so I'm just going to go to the default, which is Smarty with beard. Garth is going to talk to us about psychology of political ideological preferences. Thanks, Garth.
So I could have had that if I hadn't sent you
Brother, hope you can see that.
Yeah.
No.
It's not the tripod.
There's nothing you can do about it.
Anyway, this is a values map got from the World Value Surveys, and it's the traditional values that side, and then they call the secular values up here, and there's survival values on the bottom one.
Sorry, Garth, can you speak a little bit louder?
Yes, I'll try.
You're competing with the waiting off.
Survival values and self-expression values, and they've divided the countries. Well, they've labelled most of them, but there are more countries in their survey. But they find they fit together quite well. You've got Confucian up here, Confucian values, all the sort of Eastern China, Japan, that sort of thing.
Sorry, Garth, what are the axes?
Survival values against self-expression values on the horizontal. Okay, the x-axis. On the y-axis is traditional versus secular. Okay. So you can see Confucian side, they're quite secular rather than traditional, but they lean towards more survival values than self-expression. Islamic countries are down here, traditional and survival. And there's sort of Protestant Europe up here, Catholic Europe, South Asia, Latin America, the English-speaking world, and I think this is Africa. And we're over here somewhere. South Africa. What I have found, for example, is that as there's development, countries sort of start shifting up on that angle. They become more secular, less traditional, more self-expression rather than survival stuff. When countries are under survival pressure, they tend to become more conservative and authoritarian.
So where's the US then?
US, I think it's here. So
At the top right, what countries are
this is Sweden, Germany, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, Iceland, Switzerland. Eh?
Sweden, top right.
Yeah, top right.
Secularism and self-expression. Norway.
Well, this is just a basic distribution of values. I mentioned some things that sometimes the circumstances can change the values. So as people become safer, this is World Value Survey.
When?
Oh, this picture is from 2008, but they've got something on their site where you can trace it from about 1980 up to today. There's like a video and you can see these things change. But you try to use the Wi-Fi here. But all right, now I'm going to move on to this one. Now, some of you are familiar with this. This is Haidt stuff, Jonathan Haidt, the value survey with harm, fairness, some basic values, harm, fairness, moral values, loyalty, authority, purity. And he found that, you could divide liberals and conservatives. It explained quite a lot about their behavior and why they argue with each other, why they don't understand each other from this. But there was a healthy group of people that didn't quite fit right and turned out to be libertarians. And so I got this data basically from a study on personality or values of libertarians.
Sorry, Garth, what is the x-axis here?
Okay, I'll tell you. These are on the x-axis. This is the score on any particular value. So harm, for example, us is libertarians. I didn't want to say libertarian and liberal because it wouldn't fit in. So I'm just saying us, conservatives and liberals. So on the harm value, see liberals they think that's much more of a moral issue. That morality is about harm to them. Less so to conservatives and libertarians, even less so, but just a little bit less than conservatives. So this scale is just how strongly you hold the value on the vertical axis. You'll see fairness. Groups don't really differ that much. They differ quite strongly on loyalty. Obviously, conservatives are quite strong on loyalty. Libertarians are quite close to liberals, American style, on quite a lot of these things. Purity, again, conservatives are very strong. Purity and authority, such as, respect your minister, your politicians. Purity is just like I don't know how to describe it, like disgust, feelings of disgust. So if you easily get, if cleanliness and that sort of thing matters a lot to you, you think that's a matter of morality, then you would be high on purity. And conservatives generally are kind of like that. So part of their obsession with sexual morality probably falls under that too. And then the two economic ones, economic liberty, and we call it social liberty, but lifestyle. You can see where the libertarians are right up at the top, they're like extreme. And the liberals are down here on the economic end. So, in terms of Hyatt's value or moral survey, this is how libertarians fit in. And generally, if you leave out the liberty ones, which wasn't in Hyatt's original scheme, we're kind of low on all the moral values. As they in the study put it, that we see liberty as a moral value at the expense of the other values. But you'll see later on as I go further down that it's a temperamental thing as well. So I don't think it's like just swapping one for another. It's just certain kind of temperament that we have make some of these things more appealing to us than others. This is, I think it's a Schwartz value survey. You can see we're with liberals in a lot of these, with hedonism, need for stimulation, conformity. Conservatives like conformity and security and tradition. Liberals and libertarians not so much. I found this quite interesting with the power, that the conservatives were slightly above the others, need for power. Universalism, you see liberals said we pretty much people in Africa and US citizens should count much the same. Whereas libertarians and conservatives say, no, you look after your own first. Or, your own could be myself or my family. Where libertarians aren't big on benevolence. Well, not much lower than the others, but still. And of course, we're high on self-direction. Let me see. There's lots more of these. The way we see morals, we tend to, you can see the liberals tend to be more idealistic, and we're less so, become more pragmatic. But we also see, we're in the middle in terms of how we see, are they objective values, or is just one society's or group's values as good as another moral system, and we're kind of in between. Whether we think all moral traits, are they important for your self-identity? Is it important to see yourself as a moral person or not? And for conservatives, it tends to be very important, and for libertarians, not so much.
Did it fall over?
Yeah, it fall over. It's like right on the right-hand side. Self-relevance of independence.
Yeah.
And self-relevance of other pragmatic traits. It's all pretty much the same. So we don't differ on that sort of thing. Some of you are also quite familiar with these. These are the big five. And they map nicely onto the Myers-Briggs. So extroversion is obviously... Libertarians are less extrovert than the other groups. They were more introverted, if you like. They're less agreeable or more T-type.
No, we're not.
Eh? Speak to conservatives. But this is self-report, so they're talking about themselves here. I don't know why they decided to label this dimension agreeableness, but the people who designed the Big Five thing picked it up. But on the Myers-Briggs, it's the T side of the TF scale, thinking, feeling scale. So we're libertarians tend to be significantly more thinking style than the feeling style, and you can see this why there's an excess of men amongst libertarians. We're also less conscientious, or J-type. We'd be more P-type on that Myers-Briggs. We're less neurotic. Liberals tend to be a bit neurotic, and we're with conservatives on that. But we're quite high on this openness. This openness to experience on the Myers-Briggs, the N-type, so even higher than the liberals. And this is a scale on which it predicts whether you'll be attracted to liberal groups like the Democratic Party or so. Significantly more than conservatives. Conservatives tend to be the more S-type thing, but you can see that we're above even liberals on that one. And then there's how do we approach the world? I already said we tend to be more T-type than F-type. So this has a little bit more detailed look at our temperament. Empathic concern for others. This is also wrapped around. We're kind of way off at the bottom. Feeling of personal distress, and maybe Scholl's an exception here. But next to the conservatives. There's not that much difference between the groups on that one. Perspective taking, try to see it from the other person's point of view. I'm not quite sure what fantasy is, but there we go. Disgust, you'll see the conservatives are right up there. And this is a scale that does predict whether you'll be attracted to conservative groups, this particular one. So on these two, with the openness and the disgusting, we tend to expect libertarians to fit in with the liberal groups. But you can see the other differences. Like, for example, not very big on empathy. This one is an interesting scale. It talks about your reactions to if someone tells you what to do, and tries to force or try to persuade you to do something. Libertarians find this seriously off-putting. They get upset about it. That's the one thing they do get upset about. This is Simon Baron Cohen, is Borat's brother. He developed this scale, empathizer, sympathizer. Groups are pretty much together. We're systemizer, yes. Okay, never mind. I'm dyslexic, so. You can see we're on the less empathizer scale and the more cognitive kind of thing, that we try to make some sort of logical system out of it rather than just feel empathy with people. There's a need for cognition scale. Again, we're right up at the end. This is a trolley problem. I posted this on Libsa. So many of you will be familiar with it. Funnily enough, libertarians are more utilitarian on that. They would move the switch. And there were two versions of it. There was the light one saying, would you move a switch, or would you push a fat person in the front of the train to stop it? And in both cases, libertarians are more utilitarian than the other groups. There's guys lying on the train track, and you can save them by putting a switch to divert the train, and they will miss them. Or the harsher one is if there's a bridge in the way with a fat guy standing on it, and you push the fat guy over in front of the train or with a trolley, and will stop the trolley that way. The initial one where you divert the train, there's one person lying there on the tracks, and where it was initially heading, there about, say, 10 people. So will you sacrifice one person to save 10? And that sort of thing. So that's why it's a utilitarian thing. Hey?
Will you push the fat guy to save 10 people?
Yes.
Or will you divert and only save one?
No, you would divert to save the 10, but you'll kill another person lying on the train, on the track.
But when you do that, you're just pushing a button and then changing.
One is like pushing a button, as where you actually sit. The person, the other.
All of the people involved in the model innocent. Yes.
I thought the physical one where you had to push.
You're going to kill the guy.
I thought where you have to push the guy, you would actually save more people.
Yes.
But it's more repellent to do it.
A similar version is if you need all sorts of body parts for transplants. You could save 10 lives by killing one patient who just happened to be there for something minor. Is that okay? And that's kind of similar to the harsher version. There's cognitive reflection task.
I never understood that version until now. If you're comparing like with like, all you're choosing is, do you want one person or 10 people sacrificed?
Yes.
There's no other variable.
Will you take action? Yes. That's the key.
You take
Or
action.
will you just let it
Interfere
happen?
with
10 people are about to die. If you take action, will lead to one person dying instead.
Okay, I'm intrigued about who would not.
Yes, I know the reason. If you're conservative, what do you do?
Most people who study law would not, because once you take action, you're responsible for the person's life. That's
Conservatives
That's
are
why I
more
said
likely
there are
not
no
to
other
do.
variables. You're introducing new variables. That's
No.
not part of
No.
the
I don't think that
calculus.
is the truth.
Conservatives are more likely not to. But there are not big differences between the groups. This cognitive reflection task is, if you've been into biases and that sort of thing, there's a short test where you get, the question is phrased in such a way where if you go with your intuition, your fast thinking, you'll get the wrong answer. And there's a lot of bait to get you to do that. And if you sit back and think a little bit, you'll get the right answer. And libertarians are more likely to get the right answer. So overall, libertarians have a much more cognitive way of looking at the world and less of a thinking. Liberals and conservatives have a little bit more of a feeling one, but in different ways. Less sort of logical, cold logic. There's a various collectivist and individualist questions. The horizontal is say on the same level. So, if you say, well, we're all in this together, we all count the same, that'd be collectivism on a horizontal thing. On a vertical level, it would be, there's some hierarchy in it, but you're doing your duty, or you would sacrifice your particular interests to a collective, that sort of thing. So for something like a nationalist, conservative, they're high on that sort of thing. and liberals are less, and libertarians much less on either of those collectivism ones. On the individualism one, you can see it's the other way around. We're kind of similar to conservatives, and we differ from, when it comes to hierarchy, they're from liberals. And then
In the same place with the horizontal individuals.
we're with conservatives. No. They are, some kinds of individualism and collectivism are more or less popular in general. That's why you find all of them kind of shifted up left or right. But at this stage, I'm just pointing out the differences. This is, do you identify with your local community? How much, do you identify this with your country and with the world at large? And you see libertarians are pretty much at the bottom on all of those. And conservatives like community, and especially country, with liberals in between. This is, various theories of love, or how much do you love your family? How much do you love your friends? Love of other people not included, generic others, basically. There's quite a difference between liberals and everyone else in this one. Romantic partners, these are all folded over again, but they're quite close to libertarians, so not much difference in romantic partners. And then they combine all these various things. Do you have broad or a narrow social or tight social connection? Broad mean like society at large or the world at large, other people. So you see libertarians are particularly low on that one. With the tight social connection, libertarians are low again, but you see this is the one where conservatives and liberals differ. Like nationalism, your community, your family, that sort of thing. Okay. So, in general, those who are open to experience are attracted to liberal ideologies, whereas those high on disgust are attracted to conservatism. Libertarians are high on openness and low on disgust, but differ from liberals in being less inclined to feel and more inclined to cognition. Libertarians also feel less connected to people than either conservatives or liberals. Libertarians have fewer intuitions of obligations to or dependence on others. And since we moralize our social preferences, libertarians are inclined to focus on individual freedom rather than altruism in terms of morality and values. So there's quite a strong temperamental component in this, that where most of us, libertarians on average, at least in the States, they just find it more difficult to connect to people and easier to connect to ideas. I suppose it's as simple as that.
How did they define libertarians in the study?
Well, self-defined. There were many, many thousands. It's a very big study. And look, next I want to compare essential disagreements between conservatives and progressives, or reaction and conservatives on one side, progressives, liberals on another. The most important one is a normative disagreement, is like on basic values. Progressives, for example, would say, our subjective values are worth pursuing in and of themselves, just because it makes us feel good. It does not particularly matter where our values come from. As long as they make you feel good, that's fine. That includes what we call wireheading or taking a happy pill. The other non-progressives tend to regard this as nihilistic. On the other side of the conservatives, they're more inclined to think they are objective values. Insofar as subjective values motivates us to ensure perpetuation of the nation or civilization or something. Our subjective values are useful. But insofar as our subjective values mislead us, such as by making non-procreative sex still feel good, and jeopardizes our sort of perpetuation, we must sacrifice our subjective values for the objective good, such as buckling down and having procreative sex, even if one would personally rather not enjoy raising kids. The conservative view is not as crude as I just put it there. There's some subtlety. They tend to think that we're kind of short-sighted creatures, and that you'll go for your subjective values will make you feel good now, but you're inclined to discount the long-term impact of a thing or what you'll want in the long term. Like, for example, perpetuating humanity, keeping civilization going, that sort of thing. So, for that reason, you want laws that sort of control morality and behavior, and perhaps encourage saving and, as I say, having children. Then there are a number of descriptive disagreements. Progressives will say humanity can master or work around nature and society. In other words, they think they can plan. It's the experts, the one who do social engineering. They think we can perfect society or get around nature. Whereas the other side thinks that humanity will always be mastered by nature or the complexity of the situation. Second one, on average, people have or can be trained to have far-sighted discount functions, which is the liberals or progressives. They're kind of optimistic about that. Optimistic in that most people can be trained to think long-term. They either are thinking long-term, or they can be trained to, where the conservatives don't think so. They think we, except for the rare person, doomed to have short-sighted discount functions. Third thing, they say culture is a variable mostly dependent on material conditions. It's obviously a Marxist thing, but it appeals to liberals, progressives generally. And whereas conservatives in the reaction tend to think culture is an independent variable, not subject to material conditions. So they reckon you can mix and match technology and monarchism, for example. Where the liberals will say that's just not possible. That the kind of political system you will end up with depends on the what's the word? Incentives. The kind of incentive structure that technology puts in place. And there's very little room for maneuver. Fourth thing, progressives think Western society is currently what they call anabolic or ascendant. And conservatives' reactions think it's catabolic or decadent. In other words, what they mean is quite a subtle thing. It's not. They don't mean just everything's getting worse. They mean Western society is weakening its ability to reproduce itself. It's kind of eating its seed or capital stock. So even though things might be looking good, we're paying a price, eventually things will start falling apart. Whereas progressives, on the other hand, say, yeah, well, there might be problems, but we can fix those without destroying liberal democracy. Progressives think our biggest population threat is overshoot and attendant resource depletion, environmental pollution, and the immiseration of living standards. But the conservatives think our biggest population threat is the opposite, a demographic death spiral. Now, often they don't mean sort of humanity in general. They might say they might be worried about specific groups. of them surviving relative to others. Progressives think immigrants are okay, where the conservatives think they're a threat to, I don't know, Western civilization, the white race, intelligent community. There are a number of things they think immigrants are a threat to, their particular culture. Number 7, this is a particularly interesting one. I got this from an economist called Tyler Cowen. He's at George Mason University. Anyway, say the status of some traditionally important groups, conservatives are particularly interested in this, need to be supported and indeed extended. This would include white male producers, but also soldiers, Christians, many but not all kinds, married mothers, gun owners, etc. He says the success of Trump may be explained in that he appeals directly to these values and not indirectly via policies and that sort of thing. And the Republican Party finds it very hard to counter him, and they fear they might lose their privileged position if Trump were to win. Older Republicans particularly feel they haven't delivered to the people in quite some time. That's why they're quite uncomfortable with Trump and why they can't counter it. Progressives, being a looser coalition of interest groups, agree less on which groups to raise in status, but agree on disliking the conservative Republic program of status allocation. That immediately puts blacks, single women, most Hispanics and immigrants in the Democrat camp, and limits the ability of Republicans to expand their appeal when they want to raise the status of groups. If they want to raise the status of groups you don't belong to, it's kind of difficult to appeal to those who don't belong, and makes them sound like oppressors. 8 different Democrats, progressives tend to be neurotic, versus on the other side the perception that conservatives, Republicans lack empathy. Number 9, progressives offer more status opportunity to academics and liberals and intellectuals, whereas the conservatives in reaction offer fairly limited or even contracting status. So they don't give academics a high enough status, which would explain why such a high proportion of academics tend to be in the Democrats. Interesting thing is at the local level, it says Republicans tend to be better at governing. The reason is that because the kind of people whose status they want to raise, what these people want, tend to lead to generally good outcomes. But the Democrats often, because they have such a wider net of competing or of different interest groups in their net, they are left to just handing out goodies and favors and that sort of thing, and it's a bit harder for them to get tough when they need to be, and they're also more inclined to want to try to have untested ideas, where the conservatives are less likely to. And what's more, progressives tend to be, or let's say conservatives tend to be easier to govern as well. So you'll end up with states that have a lot of Republicans and are governed by Republicans really function well. And Republicans and conservatives say, well, we want to just move this model over to other states, because they intuitively see how well it works. And liberals don't understand why these conservatives don't buy their clever ideas, and they just think they're being dumb and difficult, and they don't get this basic intuition that the conservatives have about what's really working on the ground. Both sides easily recognize their flaws, the flaws and weaknesses of the other side, and fail to see their own. And they only have to read news to feel better about themselves. So they never sort of basically get together. There's no reason. That's why they really don't talk to each other. Okay, so that was more or less in line with what I showed you with the height study. It just confirms it.
Is there no more slides?
Yes, they are.
Okay, well that's where this ends. It's a different one. That's the last slide. It's on here.
That's very strange.
Maybe we copied the wrong one across.
Well, it was one file, so I don't know why they didn't all come across. I did some study on philosophers. They questioned a whole lot of philosophers and philosophy students on all sorts of things on philosophical issues, and they compared, which view tends to go with which view, and what kind of discipline the philosopher was in, and which philosophers from history they like, and which areas. So I'm going to summarize. There were three moral areas, the basic moral theories. One is Deontology, which is, you'll see what that is. The other one is consequentialism, and then virtue ethics. And I'm going to look at three political ideologies, which is the egalitarian, libertarian, and communitarian. And I'm going to try to paint a picture of these, and you'll see it also kind of relates in a way. It ends up in I think quite a nice, neat system. Anyway, I'll start with normative ethics. Deontological ethics is about adherence to rules and principles. It is a duty, obligation, or rule-based ethics. The Ten Commandments are an example. An action is right or wrong in and of itself, and not because of the outcome it may lead to. Deontology is a moral absolutism in the sense that it is an act is wholly right or wrong in this philosophy. For example, it remains wrong to lie, even if the lie were to result in the avoidance of much suffering. The notion of rights, especially natural rights, is part of this ethical philosophy. Deontology has been criticized for failing to justify the authority of the rules, and because it is vulnerable to incoherence via contradictions and conflicts of the moral rules. When I looked at the data on the philosophers, I found that preference for deontology tends to go with philosophical idealism and anti-materialism. The notion that minds are not physical, and that complete free will exists, that value statements in general have a truth value, in other words, values and morals are objective, or aesthetics is objective, for example, and that truth is out there in a sort of world of Platonic forms that can be accessed through pure reason, or in the form of a priori knowledge. Empirical work is unnecessary in this view, as knowledge is directly available through pure thought, a priori thinking. There is a greater tendency towards theism in those who chose this form of ethical philosophy. A good example of this outlook is their tendency to believe that zombies are metaphysically possible. Not just conceptually, but actually metaphysically possible. Deontologists tended to avoid philosophical fields that have a materialistic bent, like philosophy of science, decision theory, and they tended to focus on fields where rules could be prescribed, like political philosophy, philosophy of law, normative ethics, philosophy of religion. They didn't, however, favor any particular political philosophy. The appeal of rules of behavior that have pretensions towards absolute truth and authority seems to be grounded in a more general tendency to believe in the reality of abstractions and to consider these to be above mere material. Okay, that's deontology. And they call it consequentialism. Consequentialism is the view that the ultimate basis for any judgment of the rightness of an act is the consequences of the act. If the consequences are good, then the act is moral. Morality in this view is not absolute but proportional to the good done or the harm avoided. One of the better known consequentialist views is utilitarianism, but it's wider than utilitarianism, where the aim of ethics is the greatest happiness of the greatest number. It seems intuitively obvious that behavior that makes lives better is praiseworthy, but consequentialism has been criticized. It is said to permit unfair imposition of cost on people who have done no wrong, if the overall consequences are thereby increased. The problem of measuring goodness of outcome has always plagued consequentialism. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to find a common scale, and even where there was one, it's very difficult to rule out contrary long-term consequences. It has also been argued that consequentialism is too demanding intellectually and that it requires an attitude to be so impersonal as to be alienating. Unsurprisingly, given that deontology and consequentialism are often contrasted, I found that favouring this form of normative ethic tends to be related to favouring a naturalistic view of the world and a physical view of the mind. For them, the will is not seen as completely free, if at all, but subject to material causes and effects. Consequentialists tend to believe that the contents of the mind are pictures in the head and de-emphasize the feel of mental experiences. They tend to believe that although zombies are conceivable, they are metaphysically impossible. They are also more likely to be atheists. To them, psychological continuity determines whether someone is the same person over time. Consequentialists deny that values can have truth value, or that any a priori knowledge is possible. Naturally, they are more inclined to see the need for empirical evidence and have less faith in armchair rationalism than deontologists. They are less likely to worry about how do you know that questions, and to focus on the fit between belief and the real world. Consequentialists tend to favour philosophical fields that have a materialist bent and involve some kind of optimization problem, and they avoid conservative philosophical fields. Politically, they favour egalitarianism and reject communitarianism. A preference for consequentialism seems to be part of a general tendency to believe in material cause and effect and disbelieve in the reality of abstractions. With such a worldview, the calculations of material harm and welfare may seem to be the only meaningful option. Then the third big field of ethics is virtue ethics. Many of you may not have heard about this one. But here, the driving force of morality is not adherence to absolute principles or the outcome or benefit of harm of the conduct, but what it implies about the character of the person, the virtues and vices developed by the person. For example, saints seem to be ordained especially moral individuals on the basis of extreme exemplification of the four cardinal virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation, and also the three religious virtues: faith, hope, and charity. Purity is another popular virtue, especially with conservatives. Buddhist virtues might be compassion and discipline. Badness, on the other hand, is seen as possession of certain vices: wrath, greed, sloth, pride, lust, envy, and gluttony. I know I suffer from lust and gluttony. This approach has been criticized because there is cross-cultural and historical disagreement on what the vices and virtues are, and because the approach often doesn't tell one what to do in specific situations. For example, murder isn't condemned as wrong. Rather, the murderer is seen as lacking in compassion or fairness. For Nietzsche, however, this relativism and lack of focus on the act per se are things to be sought rather than avoided. I found that philosophers who favoured virtue ethics tended to believe that the mind isn't physical and emphasize the feel of mental experience and don't think mental experience is necessarily connected to sensory data. They do think mental content is partly determined by outside influences. I'll get back to that one when I deal with Muslims later. They also tend to believe in a completely free will. Virtue ethicists tend to think that knowledge or truth depends to some extent on context or perspective. They think of truth in terms of how do you know that, and have doubts about how much one can really know. They tend to believe that whether a person remains the same person depends on more than psychological or bodily continuity. In other words, something like a soul. And particularly they deny the psychological continuity. So somebody could have brain damage, and to them they're still pretty much the same person. Whereas the consequentialists would probably deny that they're the same person. They lack the deontologist belief in the reality of abstractions. They see more organic connections around them and look towards a personal, traditional, community-based approach rather than cold impersonal principles and root law. Okay, we'll get to politics quickly. Egalitarianism is a school of thought that favors some kind of equality between people, or even living things. The basic presumption is that people have the same fundamental worth in the eyes of, say, in the eyes of God. Of course, we all have the same quality of being rational, and therefore should be given the same consideration and respect. Politically, this implies being treated as equals and having the same political, social, economic, and civil rights. Social equalitarianism stresses greater equality of economic outcomes or political power and preferred decentralized power. The basic presumption of equal worth has been questioned. For much of human history, this presumption has been denied, and even today, people don't really act as though they believe it. If an average egalitarian had to decide between whether a film star or random working class stranger got a kidney, most wouldn't be willing to make the decision by tossing a coin. Another criticism that it is often anti-meritocratic. Found that egalitarians tended to view the mind in physical terms and consider the world to have limited freedom from cause and effect. They de-emphasize the field of mental experience and emphasize a picture in the head view. They believe in psychological continuity determines whether someone remains the same person. Egalitarians tend to believe that truth doesn't depend much on context or perspective. They don't think truth applies to moral statements. And although much religion is in principle egalitarian, in practice egalitarians are much more likely to be than non-egalitarians to be atheists. Ethically, egalitarians think personal character is unimportant and good outcome is important. As philosophers, they tend towards normative ethics and political and legal philosophy, and avoid philosophical history and religious philosophy. It's not at all clear from other philosophical beliefs why egalitarians favor equality. Insofar as egalitarianism is part of progressivism, the picture makes more sense. They are more likely than non-egalitarians to be secular humanists that stress material welfare. Next is libertarianism. A group of philosophies, well, I don't know, I don't think I need to define that. I'm going to skip over the criticisms as well.
Like we normally do.
Well, you'll just poo-poo it anyway. Anyway, as benefiting the origin of the term, I found libertarianism strongly associated with the belief in free will libertarianism. The idea that free will is incompatible with determinism, and that since we have free will, determinism must be false. It endorses the notion that mental experience is fairly independent of external influence. The field of mental experience is emphasized and the picture in the head view de-emphasized. Libertarians tend to go along with the view that there's no necessary connection between moral convictions and moral motives. As philosophers, they prefer the hard sciences and stay away from philosophy of life and social issues. They do seem to favor religious philosophy or metaphysics and are more inclined than non-libertarian philosophers to be theists. Naturally, they identify more with philosophers with an individualist focus, and those that hold that the view that we have is the best possible view, best possible world. They disavow philosophers who wanted to apply the same rules to all and argue some kind of collectivism. They seem to be struck by the feeling that their thinking and choices are self-determined, and they obviously want to extend this liberty into the practice of their lives. If our minds are so free to make choices, then it is entirely appropriate to expect people to decide their life courses themselves and to respect their choices. Communitarianism is an ideology that emphasizes the connection between the individual and the community. And they say the idea of a community made up of pre-community individuals is crazy to them. And they think that what you are is in some ways produced by the community you've been in. People who favor that, I'm going over the criticisms again, they're similar to libertarians in having a strong belief in free will libertarianism and stressing the independence of mental life outside causation and a field of mental experience. They differ in having a more non-naturalist and non-physical perception of life. They tend to believe in the reality of abstractions and the truth value of moral statements. They tend to be theists and attracted to religious and ancient philosophy. Finally, they prefer virtue ethics and reject consequentialism. Okay, let me just sum that up. A lot of questions were not, let me just skip that too. We can say that a strong secular materialist worldview predisposes you towards an egalitarian progressive political ideology and a consequentialist moral outlook, simply because material cause and effect is more salient and meaningful. We can say those who have a rather strong belief in free will predispose towards either libertarian or communitarian conservative political ideology, depending on how idealist or non-materialist they are. The more they lean towards materialism, the more libertarian they will tend to be. And since there's a negative relationship between free will and the materialist outlook, you would suspect that libertarians are almost have an almost supernatural belief in free will. It seems to me that the social liberal conservative dimension lines up with the materialist idealistic dimension, and the economic liberal conservative dimension lines up with the degree to which free will is believed in. So you can make like a matrix, and you can say materialist and free will. Materialist, non-free will would be your liberals. Materialist and free will be your libertarian. Non-materialist and free will be your conservatives. And then the populists would be non-materialists and non-free will. I suspect that most of the appeal of the philosophy to various philosophers has much to do with their temperament, and it's probably genetic. And a lot of the stuff that's missing from there is, I've got a whole lot of...
So they didn't have free will? No, it was preordained that it'd be missing.
Yeah, it's funny, the belief in free will will be genetically predisposed, yes. I've got a whole lot of attitudes and personality dimensions and things and heritability estimates on this. I can speed it up by saying almost everything has a heritable component, including politics. And the non-heritable component, the environmental part, is split between what makes one family different from another and what makes different siblings different from each other. And virtually all the environmental variance is in the latter, what makes one sibling different from another, and not makes one family different from another. So all these child rearing things and that are supposed to be important to how you turn out not to be important. And politically, politics tends to be about 50% heritable, pretty much across the board. Well, there's some things more than others. For example, abortion on demand is like 54%, death penalty 50%, open immigration 46%, and then on the low side you might see making racial discrimination illegal is only 34%, that kind of thing. So even there is variation, but in general, if you look at broad or big measures, it's about 50%. I wanted to briefly end off with a look at differences between Islam, Muslims, and the West, psychological differences. The first one concerns anger. We see anger as a kind of weakness and a loss of self-control, and you can lose self-esteem with that. Apparently in Muslim culture, anger is seen as a strength. It's valued. And even they have sort of days of anger where you run around screaming and shooting in the air and hopping up and down. Okay, I'll be finished before that. Muslims tend to define our lack of aggression as a weakness that can and should be exploited. To avoid such, this is what the psychologist said, to avoid such invitations of exploitation, we should speak the truth, make demands, and be consequent. In other words, carry a big stick. The second difference involves honor and self-confidence. In the Western culture, it's generally seen as a sign of honor and self-confidence if we're able to handle criticism, either with a shrug or a "you're right, thanks for helping me improve." In the Muslim culture, it's honorable to defend against criticism with aggression and to exhibit the courage to risk physical confrontation, no matter if the criticism is true or not. Islam cannot defend. Islam can only attack. That's why I never hear Muslims defend their religion through logic and reason. Almost always with intimidation and violence. It does not matter who is right. It matters who is strongest. From their perspective, from the perspective of traditional Muslim culture, the Western concept of honor is dishonorable. It makes us look pathetic and fearful. And for a religion that is basically imperialistic and aggressive, this is an invitation to attack. Third difference is concerns self-responsibility, and this is what I found really interesting. Here we talk at locus of control. In the West, we lean towards the internal locus of control, meaning that we think our lives are mainly governed by inner factors such as our own choices, our own view, our own way of handling emotions. That's why we have therapists, self-help books and that sort of thing. Muslim culture, and especially Islam, is characterized by outer locus of control. Everything that happens to you comes from outside factors. And the freedom to explore and train inner locus of control is very limited. From a Western perspective, they seem to have an embarrassing and childish victim mentality for that reason. When this mentality meets our Western compassion and questions like what would you like to do, integration is doomed to fail. Anyway, I'll skip out some of the ideology on that. Fourth difference concerns tolerance and openness. In the West, we consider it a de facto definition of a good person. In Islam, a good person is someone adhering strictly to Sharia, which is very intolerant and closed, even violent towards outside. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to predict how the meeting of those two will evolve. Anyway, there were some basic differences between some very foreign cultures, foreign to each other. I'm afraid a lot of this has been kind of disjointed. I wish I could sort of, I knew enough or understood enough to bring in some sort of meta theory about all these things. But I think the main thing is that political ideology, what appeals to you, comes basically from a basic temperament. Your temperament will lead to how you feel about certain experiences, and you'll develop intuitions about them, and then you'll start moralizing those, and you'll end up with a particular ideology that appeals to you. And then you'll struggle to communicate with opposite ideologies.
So our time is almost up. Well, it's basically up. But just a question. So are you saying that Islam is genetically, people are inclined to that kind of lifestyle, and that's incompatible with the Western genetics? From a cultural perspective?
I don't know. There's just something, Colin, I don't know, you may have come across this with the reactionaries, neo-reactionaries, who like to think that there's a genetic basis of different cultures. What I'm talking about is study within a culture. So the differences between people relatively liberal or conservative or whatever within a culture tend to be quite temperamentally based. But I don't know whether the whole culture will be.
So, it could
So
be
for
that
example,
people
if you adopt an Arab person in their childhood and raise him up in a libertarian household,
you're hoping that they have the temperament.
yeah, I don't know if you'd have to do this over thousands of people to see, what the average is.
They're trying it in Germany at the moment.
I would say
No, they're not. They're leaving the children with their Muslim parents. We're talking about adopting people from that genetic pool into another one and see what happens on a large scale. So I don't know. But I don't think it's...
Is the speech over?
The speech is over. I don't think it's totally implausible, but I don't know.
Do you guys want to have a quick 4 minutes for questions and then just stand up and take a quick break?
I found it very surprising that, according to your survey results, libertarians cared less about security than either conservatives or liberals. I normally find myself caring a lot more about security than the people around me who are non-libertarian. Am I alone in that?
No.
I don't
I don't worry about it. So.
Okay. I find that very interesting.
Just ask your question again.
I generally, when interacting with the normals out there, tend to care a lot more about security than they do. And I thought that was a standard.
National security?
No, physical security.
Crime.
Yes.
Crime.
And I thought that was a standard libertarian position.
Because
Apparently
that's a
I'm
mix of both. So, if you maybe less concerned about national security, into libertarian.
I'm a nation of one.
So you don't care about...
That's why every time this definition of libertarian is very important. Who is a libertarian?
Well,
Am I
so
not?
they're self-defined. So
I'm not sure. In some sense,
Frances is at the opposite extreme from you. She has zero concern about security ever. It worries the hell out of her.
Okay.
She thinks alles zal recht komen.
So that's what you're saying about you and Gav.
Yeah,
You're
I mean,
opposites.
security to me
So they
are...
both.
who was next?
I won't hold you to this, but do you think the only solution to the current Arab problem is to annihilate them?
Well, or us.
So that wasn't my...
What's the problem?
No.
Extraordinary question.
Yes or no? What was your answer?
Needs a solution.
Sorry, I mean, just want your opinion on it, but
No,
as I say, I won't hold you to
I
it.
don't think that's the answer.
So you just to clarify, do you believe that although we cannot engage with them rationally, there will never...
No, I'm saying there's
Islam.
big differences.
Sorry?
I'm saying there are difficulties, and maybe there are ways around it, but I think it will be very difficult. So maybe excluding immigrants is one, rather than annihilate them. that's a less tricky one.
Big war.
So it's trying to get you to support Trump's position.
But Garth, don't you think that if a Muslim child there's an inheritable factor, they were adopted into, it might show out in a difference between maybe being more conservative versus liberal? Because the personality factor might have to do with family security, safety.
Maybe like
I
that
see more
very
of-
first picture I showed, for example, where they're all high on survival values and tradition. But there are differences. I've sort of painted a picture that they're all the same, but there are quite big differences. Even though Iran is a theocracy, when you look at the actual value positions, when they can answer anonymously, they're quite liberal compared to, say, Egypt or...
Yeah, you just compare Turkey to
Turkey.
Syria.
I don't know, but Saudi Arabia might be more conservative than Iran. But, and they may be for genetic reasons.
But it's unlikely that the actual Muslim religion is inherited. It would be
No.
personality,
No,
attitude.
one thing that has a very low
conservative or
heritability
liberal.
is your denomination or particular religion. But how religious you are is heritable.
Last question.
Yeah, you might have answered this, and if so, I didn't get it, so let me pin it down. It seems to me that almost everybody, whether conservative or liberal, left, right, libertarian, non-libertarian, tends to adopt a position that pops up from the limbic system into the frontal cortex and then set about defending it. In other words, the idea that you have some rational explanation for your view is reverse. That you don't. You generate a fabrication.
Libertarians are more inclined to want to rationalize.
Yes. So in other words, they're not willing to say, look, that's how I am. They want to fabricate or confabulate.
Well, I'm particularly strong on wanting a justification
For what
like
you
a
think.
solid intellectual, grounding for.
Do you think you're any better than other people? Or
No, I don't think I've got anywhere near.
So you
But
also
I want
set about
that.
defending your impulse.
Yes, I try to avoid it for sure. Yes.
So
they're not
someone, are you for or
consequential.
against the death penalty? The person says for. You say why? They don't say I haven't the foggiest idea. That just appeared.
No, you mean you'll start looking for reasons like.
Try and explain
killing
it.
innocent people.
Because if you got there by starting tabula rasa, gathered the data and reached a conclusion. But in fact, now, are any of these groups different that way?
Well, the consequentialists are.
The libertarians are probably a little bit better. Remember that one test I mentioned? The 3 little questions where they try to appeal to your intuition, and that would lead you to the wrong answer. Libertarians did better on that questionnaire than the others. The differences weren't large. It was, but still detectable statistics.
Okay, now what can one do to try and be better at it yourself? In other words, if somebody says, am I for or against the death penalty, is there something I can do to reach the conclusion rationally rather than just by feeling? That I then set about justifying.
Deliberate view to criticize your third position and to understand your opponent's position better than they can. So if you could pass like an ideological Turing test, if, for example, you use the liberal arguments against the death penalty, would they think, oh yeah, that's exactly what I would say. But you could articulate their argument better than them. Make a deliberate attempt to do that kind of thing. But
Was that Denner to advance the 4 things? Start by stating the adversary's case better than they've done. And he had 4 things, one of which was humour. Are you familiar with that? His 4 principles for persuasion. But that's for persuading someone else that you're right.
But
That's
you're also
not for,
persuading
it's not
yourself.
for checking yourself.
Yes. You're not, as Kahneman said, you're never going to be really good at it, but you can improve. One thing, for example, on the whole bias thing, one thing you can improve on is calibration. You estimate what your range of error is, so, or how confident you are in your view. You can improve. People say, "Yeah, I'm very confident," whether they're wrong 20% of the time. And you can learn quite effectively, I believe, that you can learn to say, "Okay, I'm only 80% sure of this view," and to be a little bit more humble about that kind of thing.
Now, the one derivative of which is in fact more rational or better, your intuition or your cognitive process? In other words, maybe that checking is actually less efficient or less objective than your intuition.
If you've got a rustle in the grass and there's a big chance of a lion actually being there, yes, it's probably, fast thinking is probably the more rational way to do it.
Okay, so
it depends on the circumstances.
let's take a very quick break. I think 6 minutes is probably enough to have a quick tea and a smoke, and then let's be back at 3 o'clock.
Hopefully not tea and smoke.
Be while I smoke.
We'll try and catch up a little bit of time, but thanks, Garth.